The alarm did not build slowly. It did not give me time to wake up, stretch, pour a cup of coffee, and ease into the kind of morning a person deserves before the world ends. It hit all at once, a single sharp tone that cut through the station's low hum like a blade through paper. And before my feet touched the floor, I already knew what it meant. I had been waiting 40 years for that sound. My name is Yara Osei, and I am the commanding officer of the Meridian, a deep space watch station positioned 2 astronomical units above the plane of the solar system, so far from Earth that sunlight takes 11 minutes to reach us. From up here, the sun looks small, patient, like an eye that has seen everything, and is no longer surprised by any of it. I have been stationed on the Meridian for 11 years. Before that, I spent 14 years at the ground command facility in the Atacama Desert, tracking signals, logging contacts, writing reports that almost nobody read. Before that, I spent 7 years in university learning physics and orbital mechanics and xenolinguistics, which is the study of alien languages, a field that barely existed when I enrolled and was still largely theoretical when I graduated. The people who hired me did not care that the field was theoretical. They said, "We need someone who can think clearly when the rules stop making sense." I said yes. I was 22. I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to. I understand it now. The Perimeter Defense Directorate, the organization I work for, does not appear in any government budget that the public can access. It has no official website. It is not mentioned in any news article, any political speech, or any academic paper. As far as the rest of humanity is concerned, it does not exist. As far as I am concerned, it is the only thing standing between the 8 billion people living on that small, bright planet below me and a universe that has never once promised to be kind. 40 years ago, something happened that changed everything. A probe was moving through the outer solar system, a routine deep space survey craft, the kind humanity had been launching since the late 20th century. It was returning data on the composition of the Kuiper Belt, when its cameras captured something that should not have been there. A structure, not a natural formation, not ice or rock shaped by gravity over millennia. A structure, deliberately made, angular and purposeful, sitting at a precise coordinate as if it had been placed there with a measuring tape. The probe transmitted 6 hours of imagery before contact was lost. Those 6 hours were enough. The structure was not one object. It was the edge of a boundary, a perimeter marked at intervals by objects that serve no obvious defensive function, no weapons array, no shield generator, nothing a human military engineer would recognize as a deterrent. They were markers, simple, cold, and absolute, and they formed a perfect ring around our solar system. Someone had drawn a fence around Earth. The images were classified within 4 hours of receipt. A task force was assembled within a week. Within a month, that task force became the Directorate, funded quietly, staffed carefully, and given a single purpose: understand what the fence means, and prepare for the possibility that someone might try to cross it. 3 years after the discovery, a second event occurred. A vessel, nothing like anything in our records, emerged from a fold in space just beyond the boundary markers. It was smaller than our initial probes, sleek and dark, and it did not move or maneuver. It simply opened a channel on every known radio frequency simultaneously and transmitted a message. The message was in 12 different languages. 7 of them we had never encountered. 5 of them were human languages: English, Mandarin, Swahili, Russian, and Arabic. Nobody has ever explained how they knew which languages we used. The message was spoken, not written. The voice that delivered it was flat and toneless, clearly synthesized, the way a translation program speaks when it is being accurate rather than warm. It said the following, and I have memorized it so completely that I could recite it in my sleep. This zone is designated forbidden by the accord of those who have passed through it. The designation carries consequence. The consequence is permanent. Those who enter without passage rights will cease. We name this warning. We do not repeat it. That was it. No introduction, no identification of the speaker, no offer of dialogue, no explanation of what passage rights were or how one might obtain them. The vessel closed its channel, folded back into wherever it had come from, and was never seen again. For 40 years the boundary held. We watched species approach it. 3 different alien civilizations, each one more technologically advanced than the last, each one with vastly more firepower than anything humanity possessed, brought their vessels to the edge of the marked zone, held position for varying lengths of time, and then turned around. One of them held position for 11 days. Their ships were enormous, mile-long constructs that dwarfed anything we had ever built, and they sat at that boundary, like a dog sitting at the edge of a road it had been trained not to cross. And then they left. We never knew what changed their minds. We never found out whether it was the warning itself, or something they had heard from others, or something they detected that we couldn't. They simply left. They did not come back. We used that time. The Sentinel Network was the idea of a physicist named Glenn Carver, who joined the directorate at age 31 and spent the next 3 decades giving everything he had to a project he knew he would never see completed. Glenn is 68 now and lives in a small house in New Zealand where he grows tomatoes and refuses to talk about his work. I think about him sometimes when I sit at my station and watch the numbers on the console that tell me the Sentinels are awake. 3,400 platforms, each one the size of a cargo container, each one powered by a compact fusion core that can sustain operation for 200 years without maintenance. Each one armed with a technology that Glenn's team spent 12 years reverse engineering from a piece of Virecai hardware we found drifting at the boundary's edge in 2061. A piece of hardware that had clearly been in space for a very long time and clearly did not belong to any civilization we had records of. The Sentinels were hidden well, buried in asteroid rock, anchored to crater floors on the far side of moons, resting on the ocean beds of Europa and Titan, distributed across the solar system, with the patience of someone who expects to wait a long time and has made peace with that. They had no visible emissions, no radar profile, no communication signal. They listened passively, through a network of gravitational sensors that operated on principles so far outside standard physics that the 15 people who fully understood them could fit in a single conference room. When the right signal pattern was detected, when something crossed the boundary without authorization, the Sentinels did not need to be told. They knew. The moment that alarm sounded, I already knew 2 things. First, something had crossed the boundary. Second, the Sentinels were already awake. I pulled on my uniform and walked to the command deck at a pace that people watching me might have described as calm. It was not calm, it was the opposite of calm. It was every single feeling compressed so tightly that none of them could move. Like a fist closed so hard the knuckles go white. But I had trained for this. We had all trained for this. The training does not make it easier. It makes it possible. Lieutenant Owen Grant was already at his station when I entered the command deck. He was 29, the youngest officer on Meridian, and the only person on the crew who had never once asked me whether we actually expected something to happen. Everyone else, at some point in their first year, had looked at the quiet sensors and the empty boundary and asked that question with their eyes even when they didn't ask it out loud. Owen never did. He had looked at the data from the first week, read every classified incident report from the last 40 years, and arrived at his post with the quiet certainty of someone who had done the math. 4 contacts, he said before I reached my station. Crossing confirmed at the outer boundary. They are not slowing down. How many total, I said. He tapped his display and turned it toward me. 14 capital ships, 60 escort fighters. 3 vessels with a mass signature consistent with colony equipment. He paused. They brought settlers, Commander. I looked at the screen. 14 bright points of light moving through my solar system, with the unhurried confidence of people who have never been told no. I sat down. I breathed. Outside the viewport, 40 years of preparation sat waiting in the dark, patient as stone, ready as it had always been. And somewhere in the deep outer dark, the ship carrying those 14 capital vessels and 60 fighters and 3 colony barges full of settlers was moving toward a planet that had spent 4 decades learning a very quiet, very permanent lesson about what it means to cross a line you were warned about. The console in front of me showed the Sentinel activation status. Every single one of them was green. I reached forward and entered my authorization code. Not to fire. The Sentinels did not need my authorization to fire. My code served a different purpose. It told the network that a human being, a specific human being with a specific chain of accountability, was present and aware. It was a formality, in one sense. In another sense, it was the most important thing I would ever do. I entered the code, and I waited, and the alarm tone faded into silence, because the system had registered my presence and no longer needed to announce itself. The only sound on the command deck was the soft breath of the ventilation system, and Owen's fingers on his console, and the distant, imperceptible hum of a solar system that had just become something those 14 ships did not yet know it was. I thought about the 8 billion people below me. I thought about Glenn Carver and his tomatoes. I thought about the flat, toneless voice from 40 years ago that had said those words only once and never repeated them. We name this warning. We do not repeat it. I thought about all the nights I had sat in this chair and watched the boundary and wondered if the day would ever come, if I was guarding against something real or something imagined. I thought about the officers who had sat in this chair before me and never seen this day, who had retired or transferred or simply grown old at their stations, waiting for an alarm that never came during their watch. It came during mine. I watched the 14 bright points of light move deeper into the solar system, and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel fear. What I felt sitting in that chair in the cold light of the command deck with the Sentinel network burning green on my console was the particular weight of a moment that has been a long time coming. Not dread, not excitement, readiness, pure, absolute, and complete. The Kareth Dominion's translator drone reached Meridian at 0322 station time, 48 hours before their fleet reached the boundary. It was a small object, roughly cylindrical, about the size of a filing cabinet, and it transmitted on open frequencies the moment it cleared the outer sensor range, broadcasting in a dozen languages simultaneously, which told me two things immediately. They had done their research, and they expected to be understood. I was not asleep when the notification came. I had not been sleeping much since the initial contact alert. My bunk was 2 corridors from the command deck, and each time I closed my eyes I found myself running numbers in my head. Trajectories and timelines and activation sequences. Not because I needed to check them. The computers did all of that. But because my mind could not stop working through the problem the way a tongue keeps finding a sore tooth. I got up, dressed, and walked to the communications bay. The drone's message was already being transcribed by the time I arrived. Lieutenant Cara Flynn, our communications officer, was seated at the primary terminal with a posture so rigid she looked carved from the chair. She was 34, sharp-eyed and methodical, and had joined the directorate after 6 years decoding signals intelligence for a different organization she was not allowed to name. She handed me the transcript without being asked. I read it standing up. The message was formal in the way that a boot coming through a door is formal. It used diplomatic language in the same way that certain people use polite words to deliver a threat. The words are correct, but the meaning underneath them is completely clear to anyone paying attention. The Kareth Dominion, it stated, had completed a territorial survey of the zone designated in their navigation charts as Sector 12, Deep Fringe, and had determined the zone to be unclaimed and undefended. The designation of the zone as restricted by a prior warning was noted but considered void, as the originating party of that warning had not made formal contact with the Dominion and therefore held no recognized authority over the space in question. In short, your fence does not count because the people who built it never introduced themselves to us. The message continued. The Dominion intended to establish a settlement within the zone, specifically on the 3rd planet of the primary star system, which their charts designated as a Class 4 habitable world. Current inhabitants of the surface were noted and would be evaluated for integration or relocation, depending on the findings of the Colonial Assessment Team accompanying the fleet. Evaluated for integration or relocation. I read that sentence 3 times. Cara was watching me from the corner of her eye, keeping her face professionally neutral and not entirely succeeding. I set the transcript down and looked at the drone's position on the display. It was hovering patiently at the edge of sensor range, waiting for a response. They want an answer, Cara said. They will get one, I said. I sat down at the communications terminal and typed Earth's entire response myself. It took me 45 seconds. The message contained the following. A set of 12 precise coordinates marking the boundary perimeter, an exact timestamp indicating when the Kareth fleet was projected to reach that boundary based on their current trajectory, and 9 words. Do not cross this line at this time. We will not repeat this. 9 words. No explanation of what would happen. No description of our capabilities. No list of weapons or systems or treaties. No threat in the conventional sense. Just a fact stated once and a line drawn in space. Cara read it over my shoulder. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That is going to confuse them." "Good," I said. I transmitted the message, logged it into the record, and went to find coffee. The response from the Kareth fleet came 6 hours later, forwarded through the translator drone, which had apparently been instructed to remain as a relay point. The response was longer than I expected and shorter than I needed. It confirmed receipt of our message. It noted that our coordinates matched the disputed boundary perimeter already in their navigation charts. It referenced our timestamp and stated that the Dominion's fleet would proceed on its current course as planned. It concluded with a single sentence that I have since read many times and thought about carefully. Your capacity for resistance has been assessed and found to be non-threatening. Non-threatening. I sent a copy of that line to every section head on Meridian with no additional comment. I did not need to add any. The people who worked for me were smart enough to understand what it meant, and what it did not mean, and why the difference mattered. What followed in the next 36 hours was a kind of controlled silence that I have since struggled to describe to people who were not there. The crew of Meridian went about their duties with the particular focus of professionals who are very aware that they are watching history, and very determined not to let that awareness make them careless. Meals were eaten, reports were filed, instruments were checked and rechecked. Owen Grant ran 3 separate diagnostic cycles on the gravitational sensor array. Cara Flynn tuned and retuned the passive listening systems to catch any additional Kareth transmissions. Our engineering officer, a man named Henry Doyle, who had been with the Directorate for 19 years and spoke very little but noticed everything, spent 12 hours quietly auditing the Meridian's own structural integrity systems. Not because anything was wrong, but because he wanted to know the station was solid when things got loud. Meanwhile, I studied the Kareth. The Directorate's files on them were substantial. The Kareth Dominion was approximately 300 years old as a spacefaring civilization, which in the context of the galaxy was not old at all, but which was long enough to have developed a military doctrine built entirely on the logic of overwhelming force. They had encountered 6 other spacefaring civilizations. 2 of those had been absorbed into the Dominion, their technology integrated, their populations incorporated. 3 had been what the Directorate's files diplomatically called removed from independent operation, which meant they no longer existed as separate entities. The 6th was a civilization that had managed to negotiate a formal non-expansion treaty with the Dominion, by demonstrating, in very graphic terms, that any Kareth expansion into their territory would cost more than it was worth. That 6th civilization had done the one thing that made the Kareth pause. They had shown power. The other 5 had not. The other 5 had either tried to talk, or tried to run, or simply had nothing left to show. The Kareth had no record of encountering a civilization that said nothing, showed nothing, and still managed to stop them. That was, I realized, about to change. I intercepted the Kareth internal communications 30 hours before the crossing. They were not fully encrypted, which surprised me initially before I understood why. They were not fully encrypted because the Kareth did not believe they needed to be. They were not speaking the way people speak when they expect to be overheard. They were speaking the way people speak when they are certain nobody is listening. Their fleet commander was a figure their records identified as Primary Executor Varath, a title that translated roughly to Chief Military Officer with full discretionary authority. Varath had commanded 17 successful territorial acquisitions. His tactical record showed a consistent pattern: move fast, signal overwhelming force early, and accept surrender before resistance can organize. He had never needed to fire more than a warning volley in any of his campaigns. His opponents had always broken before the engagement properly began. His communications to his officers were confident in the particular way that experience produces. Not arrogant, exactly. Something more measured than arrogance, more dangerous. He had done this before, and it had always gone a specific way, and nothing in his data about Earth suggested this time would be different. Their analysts, I read, had rated us at Class 2 on a scale that went to Class 8. Class 2 meant a civilization with surface-to-orbit capability, basic interplanetary travel, and no demonstrated capacity for deep space conflict. The rating was not wrong based on what they could observe. We had, very deliberately, never demonstrated anything that would push that rating higher. The Directorate's information management protocols over the previous 40 years had been meticulous about this. Earth's public space program looked exactly like what a Class 2 civilization's space program should look like, because we had spent 40 years making sure it looked that way. Everything else was below the surface. Varath's communications showed that he was aware of our warning message. He referenced it briefly in a command meeting 18 hours before the crossing, describing it as a standard automated warning, likely a relic of whatever earlier civilization had established the boundary markers. He was not entirely wrong about that. He did not consider it a reason to slow down. He did not consider the possibility that the civilization currently transmitting the warning was not the same civilization that had placed the original markers, but had found what those markers represented, taken it apart piece by piece, understood the mechanism underneath it, and built 3,400 of their own. That thought, I imagine, had not occurred to him. I sat on the command deck during those final hours and watched the fleet approach on the long-range display. 14 capital ships in a formation designed to present maximum tactical surface. 60 escort fighters arranged in an outer screen. 3 colony barges tucked safely at the center, protected by the warships around them. carrying settlers who had been told they were going to a new home. I thought about those settlers for a long time. I want to be honest about this, because the story I am telling is a true one, and true stories do not benefit from leaving out the uncomfortable parts. The settlers aboard those colony barges did not make the decision to cross the boundary. They were told to board. They were told where they were going. They trusted the people above them, who had assessed the risk and declared it acceptable. In a just situation, they would have been warned. In a just situation, Vareth would have taken our message seriously and turned around. In a just situation, none of what was about to happen would have been necessary. We do not live in a just situation. We live in the one that exists. At 17 hours before the crossing, I transmitted a second message to the Kareth fleet. This one was not authorized by standard Directorate protocol. I sent it on my own judgment, logging it in the record with my personal command code so that there would be no ambiguity about who made the decision. The message said only this: our warning stands. We have nothing further to add. Vareth acknowledged it 6 hours later with 3 words. Acknowledgement. Proceeding as planned. I logged his response. I did not reply. At 2 hours before the crossing, I gathered the senior staff on the command deck and spoke to them for 4 minutes. I told them what they already knew, that the Kareth fleet was going to cross the boundary, that the Sentinel network was active, and that when the crossing happened, the sequence that followed would be automatic. I told them that their job in the minutes and hours afterward was to observe, record, and report with complete accuracy. I told them that whatever they were feeling about what was going to happen, I needed them to feel it later, after the work was done. Owen Grant was looking at his console. Henry Doyle was looking at the ceiling. Cara Flynn was looking at me with the expression of someone who has accepted a thing they cannot change and is simply waiting for it to arrive. I told them I was proud to serve with them. I meant it. I mean it now. At 22 minutes before the projected crossing timestamp, I went to my small office behind the command deck and sat alone for a few minutes. Through the viewport, the solar system was quiet and dark and enormous. I could not see the Sentinel platforms from here. Nobody could. That was the point. I knew they were there the way you know the ground is under you in the dark. Not because you can see it, but because you have stood on it long enough to trust it completely. I thought about Glenn Carver in his house in New Zealand, tending his tomatoes, not watching the news, not checking any communications, because he had done everything he could do 20 years ago, and he had made his peace with what came next. I thought about the flat synthesized voice from 40 years ago. The consequence is permanent. I went back to the command deck. I sat down. Owen looked at me. 2 minutes, he said. I nodded. I placed my hands flat on the console in front of me. I breathed slowly. Outside the viewport, somewhere in the deep outer dark, 14 capital ships were moving through a solar system that was no longer what they thought it was, toward a line that was no longer just a line. 1 minute, 30 seconds. The timestamp reached 0, and the crossing happened, and I was there, present and watching, with 40 years of humanity's patience waiting in the dark around me like a held breath. There is a particular quality to the moment before something enormous happens. The air does not change. The lights do not dim. The instruments do not stir. Everything looks exactly as it did a second ago, and a second before that. And yet something in the back of your mind is already processing the signal that your senses have not quite caught up with yet. A shift at the edge of awareness, like the feeling before thunder, before the sound arrives, when your body already knows. I felt that shift at the exact moment the Kareth fleet crossed the boundary. The Sentinel network's activation was registered on my console as a simple status change. 14,000 individual systems going from standby to active in a sequence so fast that the computer compressed it into a single logged event. 1 line in the record, time-stamped to the millisecond. 3,400 platforms distributed across the most remote and hidden locations in the solar system, waking up simultaneously like an enormous held breath finally released. Owen said, very quietly, "Alt platforms nominal." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Kareth fleet sensors detected the power surge almost immediately. They were good. Their detection systems were, by any objective measure, significantly more advanced than ours. That had always been the plan. We never expected to hide the activation from them. We only needed them to detect it after they had already crossed the line. The fleet's formation shifted. The escort fighters pulled inward, tightening around the capital ships in the defensive pattern their doctrine prescribed for unexpected contact. Vareth's communications channel opened, and I could hear, on the passive intercept feed, the tone of his voice change, not dramatically, not in the way that fear sounds, but in the way that a very experienced military officer sounds when something has happened that was not in his model. He was recalculating. The translation program rendered his words in flat, even English as he spoke them to his tactical officers. Source of activation energy. Distributed, multiple origins, estimated count in the thousands. Classification, unidentified. Action. Continue advance maximum sensor sweep, full weapons ready. He did not stop. That told me something important about him. A less experienced commander might have paused. A more cautious one might have retreated. Vereth did neither. He processed the new information, found no category in his experience that matched it, and chose to continue moving forward because in 17 previous engagements, moving forward had always resolved the uncertainty faster than stopping. I watched the fleet continue its advance at full speed. The colony barges, still tucked in the protected center of the formation, were broadcasting a low-level navigational signal on the civilian band, the standard identification pulse that all colonization vessels use. It was the most ordinary thing on the display. A routine signal that meant nothing tactically, just an automated system doing what it was built to do, identifying itself to any nearby infrastructure, so that docking and landing procedures could be initiated. I remember noting it because of how ordinary it was. How completely routine. 3 ships full of people who had packed their belongings and said goodbye to wherever they came from, preparing to arrive at a new home, their vessels pulsing that small, quiet signal into a solar system that was in the process of becoming something those 3 ships were not going to reach. The mass collapse technology is not dramatic. That is one of the things that Glenn Carver's team found most unsettling about it when they first reverse-engineered the principles behind it. They had expected something visually spectacular, something that looked like a weapon. What they found instead was something that looked more like mathematics, a precisely calibrated distortion of local spacetime geometry, tuned to a specific resonance frequency that caused the fabric of space in the immediate vicinity of a target to fold inward on itself, not violently, not explosively, but smoothly, the way a piece of paper folds when you press it gently, until the folded region is no longer continuous with the surrounding space. An object inside a folded region does not explode, it does not burn, it does not leave debris. The space it occupied becomes a closed geometry, disconnected from the observable universe the way the inside of a soap bubble is technically a separate volume from the air around it. Except that unlike a soap bubble, a collapsed spacetime manifold does not pop, it does not open again, it is simply no longer accessible. The objects inside it still exist in the strictest physical sense. They continue to occupy space and time, just not the space and time that anyone else can reach. The physics team had argued about this for years. Some of them found the permanence of it disturbing in a way that a simple kinetic weapon would not have been. Destruction was something they could categorize morally. This was something else. One of the physicists, a woman named Dorothy Nairn, who is now retired and will not speak to journalists, wrote in her personal log during the development period, "We are not building a weapon that kills. We are building a door that closes and has no handle on the inside." She voted to complete the project. She has never publicly explained why. I think I understand, but it is not my explanation to give. The Sentinel network did not fire all at once. The sequence was designed to be precise rather than immediate. Each platform calculated its own targeting solution independently, using the gravitational sensor data to establish exact coordinates for each vessel in the Kareth formation. The calculations took 0.7 seconds. Then the platforms began the sequence in order of threat classification: capital ships first, escort fighters second, support vessels third. From my console, the sequence appeared as a rapid cascade of status updates, each platform logging its action in order, clean and methodical, the way a checklist proceeds when every item on it is completed correctly. On the passive sensor display, the Kareth fleet began to disappear, not all at once. In sequence, the same sequence the Sentinels followed. First the capital ships. Each one vanished from the sensor feed without any transition period. No explosion, no energy signature, no debris cloud. One moment the sensor contact was there, a solid return with mass and velocity and electromagnetic signature. The next moment the contact was gone, not faded, diminished, gone, as if someone had pressed a key that deleted a row from a spreadsheet. Varath's voice on the intercept feed had changed by then. The recalculating tone was gone. Something else had replaced it, something I had not heard from him before. A quality I cannot describe precisely because it was not a human voice, but which translated, in the flat rendering of the computer, as a rapid sequence of tactical commands that stopped making tactical sense halfway through, because the assets he was commanding were no longer there to receive them. His flagship was the 9th capital ship to go. The entire sequence, from first activation to the disappearance of the final escort fighter, lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Owen's voice was completely level when he spoke. He had a gift for that. A young man's calm that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of absolute training. All Sentinel activations complete, he said. Center field clear. No contacts detected within the boundary perimeter. I looked at the display. The solar system was empty. No fleet, no debris, no energy signatures consistent with a battle. No distress signals, no emergency beacons, no automated transponders continuing to pulse on the civilian band. The colony barge's navigational signal was gone as cleanly as everything else. The space they had occupied 11 seconds ago was indistinguishable from space that had never been occupied at all. 17,000 contacts, 14 capital ships, 60 fighters, 3 colony barges. All support personnel, crew and passengers aboard each vessel. Gone in 11 seconds without a single projectile fired, without a single explosion, without a single point of light to mark the event. The solar system was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, because this quiet had a shape to it now, a defined edge. Before the crossing, the quiet was simply the absence of noise. After the crossing, the quiet was something that had been made. Henry Doyle, who almost never spoke unless he had something specific and necessary to say, said from his station at the back of the command deck, "Sentinel network returning to standby. Recloaking sequence initiated." I nodded. Kara Flynn was looking at her communications board. Nothing was coming in. For a long moment, nothing came in from anywhere. Then she said, "Karath High Command is going to know within the hour. Their communications relay at the system boundary will have been monitoring." "Yes," I said. "They will have seen the fleet cross and then nothing." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No wreckage to send a recovery team for." "No." She looked at her board again. The communications channels were completely silent. The Karath had nothing to recover because there was nothing to find. Their fleet had not been destroyed in any way that left a mark on the universe. The coordinates where 17,000 crew members and a fleet of military vessels had existed 11 seconds ago contained nothing now. Absolutely nothing. Not even the residual thermal signature that a battle leaves in space. Not even the faint scatter of electromagnetic radiation that any energetic event produces. There was a kind of message in that. I thought it was important that the message was not one I had designed. The Sentinel technology worked the way it worked, because that was how the physics operated. The cleanness of it, the completeness of it, was not chosen by anyone on the Directorate's planning committee. It was simply the nature of what Glenn Carver's team had built, and yet, the result was a boundary crossed by 17,000 beings that had simply become unreachable, and a solar system that looked precisely as it had before they arrived. No scars, no wreckage, no evidence that anything had happened at all, except in the records of those who had watched, and in the empty position on the Karath Dominion's deployment chart where a fleet used to be. I sat in my chair for a long time after the display cleared. Nobody on the command deck spoke for almost 4 minutes. I counted the time on the console clock without meaning to. We sat in the quiet that had been made, each of us alone with whatever we were carrying, and nobody tried to break it with words that were not adequate to the moment. Eventually Owen said very softly, "Commander, you should eat something." I looked at him. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his console, his hands folded on the edge of it, his face doing the careful neutral thing that 29-year-old officers do when they are trying to hold a great deal together and not make it visible. "In a minute," I said. I looked out the viewport. The solar system was the same as it had always been. The sun patient and small at this distance. The distant gleam of orbital paths. The dark beyond the boundary. Deep and quiet and ancient. Somewhere in that dark, a relay station was preparing to transmit a report to the Karath Dominion. The report would tell them that their fleet had crossed the boundary. The report would note the sudden, brief energy signature of the Sentinel activation. The report would then describe what the sensors showed in the moments following. Nothing. No battle. No debris. No distress signals. Just an empty coordinate where a fleet had been, and a solar system that had gone back to looking exactly as it looked before. They were going to have questions, a great many questions. None of them were questions I intended to answer. The first message from the Karath High Command arrived 4 hours and 17 minutes after the event. I had been expecting it sooner. They were either very methodical about verifying their data before reacting, or the implications of what their relay station had reported had required some time to fully sink in. The message was addressed formally, which surprised me. I had expected something closer to a demand. Instead, they used the standard diplomatic header. The kind of formal opening that nations use when they are communicating with another nation they officially recognize. Not a conquered territory, not an unclaimed frontier, but an equal. That shift in language was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was the length. The Karath Dominion's opening declaration, the one that had announced their intention to colonize Earth, had been 18 paragraphs of confident, measured rhetoric. This message was 6 sentences. I will not reproduce it word for word because it was classified at the highest level and is still classified, but the substance of it was as follows. The High Command had received the relay report from their monitoring station. The report was inconsistent with all known parameters of any engagement they had on record. They were requesting a full sensor data package from any Earth monitoring systems that had observed the event. They were also, in formally diplomatic language that nonetheless carried a very specific weight, requesting clarification on what had occurred. Requesting clarification, I sat with that phrase for a while. Kara Flynn brought the message to my office, printed on a physical sheet in addition to the digital file, because she knew I processed things better on paper. She set it on my desk without a word and went back to her station. I read it 3 times. The 6th sentence, the final one, was the one I kept returning to. It said, "No engagement of this nature has been recorded in any archive accessible to the Dominion, and we are requesting immediate consultation to establish what occurred, on what authority, and by what mechanism." On what authority? I thought about that question. I thought about what it would mean to answer it honestly. The authority was 40 years of preparation, 3,400 hidden platforms, a network of reversed engineered physics built from technology we found drifting in the cold of space without explanation, and the decision of a task force assembled in a crisis and sustained by people who believed the work mattered even when the years passed quietly, and nothing happened. The authority was the warning that had been given, and the certainty that the warning was real, and the decision, made clearly and with complete awareness of the consequences, to honor that certainty. I drafted my response myself. Kara reviewed it, and Henry reviewed it, and I sent it to Directorate Ground Command for authorization, which came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than I expected, and told me that the people at the top of my organization had been awake all night and were watching everything very carefully. My response to the Karath High Command was 4 sentences. The first sentence acknowledged receipt of their message. The second sentence noted that the event they were inquiring about had occurred as a direct result of their fleet's unauthorized crossing of a designated restricted perimeter, against which they had received 2 formal warnings, both of which had been logged and were available for their review. The third sentence stated that no sensor data package would be provided, as the mechanism involved was a matter of Earth's internal security. The fourth sentence said the following: Earth's boundaries remain as designated. This communication constitutes our complete response to your inquiry. I sent it. I logged it. I did not wait for a reply before going to sleep. I slept for 5 hours. It was the deepest sleep I had gotten in a week. When I woke, there were 3 developments waiting for me. The first was a second message from the Karath High Command. This one was longer than the first, noticeably so, and the language had shifted again, further toward the formal and careful end of the register, the kind of language that diplomatic services use when they are constructing a record, when they are aware that what they write now may be referenced for a long time, and want it to reflect a particular posture. The tone was not aggressive. It was not conciliatory either. It was the tone of an organization that had encountered something outside its model and was proceeding very carefully while it rebuilt the model around the new data. The second development was a message from a different source entirely, one I had not seen in 40 years. The Virakai Communication Array, the same one that had delivered the original warning in 2034, had activated during the night. It had transmitted a single signal, brief and compact, on the same frequencies it had used 4 decades ago. The signal was not a voice transmission this time. It was a data packet, encoded in a structure that our translation systems processed for 3 hours before producing an output. The output was a single glyph, a symbol from the Virekai's written communication system, one that had no precise equivalent in any human language. The translation team's best approximation, after consultation and review, was, "Now you understand why we named it." I read that translation standing in my office with a cup of cold coffee in my hand, and I stayed very still for quite a long time. The Virakai had been watching. They had seen the crossing, they had seen the response, and they had waited until it was over to send the only message they apparently felt was needed. A message that was not congratulatory, not instructive, not a warning, just a statement of recognized understanding. They had done this before. Whatever was now in the Directorate's records as the mass collapse technology, whatever we had found drifting at the boundary's edge and spent 12 years understanding, the Virakai had encountered it, or something like it, long before us. Long enough before us that they had built the markers. Long enough before us that they understood what the markers meant and why a warning needed to be given only once. They had never explained any of this to us. They had given us the name and the consequence, and left us to find the mechanism ourselves. I had spent years being quietly angry about that, the way you are angry at a teacher who makes you derive the formula instead of just giving it to you, who insists that you will only truly know it if you find it yourself. I was not angry about it anymore. The third development was a personnel communication from Directorate Ground Command, marked personal and addressed to me specifically. It was a brief message from the director, a woman named Frances Lowe, who had held the position for 12 years and had the kind of calm that comes from making extremely large decisions over a very long career. The message said, "Well done, Commander. The full assessment team will reach Meridian in 6 days. Rest your people. Rest your people." I walked to the command deck. The morning shift was in place. A quiet arrangement of capable individuals doing their jobs with the particular composed energy of a crew that has been through something and is still processing it. Owen was at his station. He had been on duty for 22 hours straight, though he had taken a mandated rest period at some point in the night, because he was the kind of person who followed mandatory rest protocols, even when everything in him wanted to stay awake and watch. "How is the boundary?" I asked. "Clear, no contacts. Sentinel network at full standby, all platforms nominal. And the outer relay stations? Passive. The Karath monitoring station is still transmitting standard telemetry. No new vessels have approached." I nodded. I pulled up the Karath High Command's second message and read it again, this time more slowly. Buried in the third paragraph, in language that was technically a statement of administrative procedure rather than a request, was the first use by any Karath official of a word I had been waiting to see. Boundary. We are seeking to establish the precise parameters of the designated boundary in order to accurately record the perimeter in our navigation systems. They wanted to know exactly where the line was. They were asking where the fence stood so that they could mark it in their own charts and make sure their vessels knew to stop there. Not because we had shown them our power. Not in the way that Varath's sixth opponent had shown power, with a weapons demonstration and a loud declaration. We had shown them something different. We had shown them an absence, a silence. A place where 17,000 crew members and a major fleet existed, and then did not, and left nothing behind for anyone to examine or argue about or explain. You cannot fight an absence. You cannot model it, plan against it, develop a countermeasure for it, or make your soldiers feel brave in the face of it. An absence is the most complete answer to every tactical question that has ever been asked, because it eliminates the question along with the questioner. They wanted to mark the boundary. I instructed Kara to transmit the boundary coordinates to the Karath High Command's diplomatic office, along with the 2 warning messages that had been sent to the fleet, and the timestamps of each. Nothing else. Just the information they asked for, complete and accurate and without elaboration. Then I went to find Henry Doyle, who was in the station's small workshop, doing something careful and precise with a calibration tool. The kind of task that his hands knew how to do while the rest of him was elsewhere. "Henry," I said. He looked up. "How are you doing?" He thought about it for a moment in the way that Henry always thought about things, fully, without rushing. "I am fine," he said. "I think I need a few more days before I have more to say about it than that." "Take them," I said. He nodded. He went back to his calibration. I stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving, watching his hands move with the steady precision of a man who trusts the work to hold him, and thought that this was one of the things humanity did well. Not the weapons, not the physics, but this. The steady, quiet determination to keep doing what needs to be done, even when the world has just changed in a way that needs time to settle. I returned to the command deck and looked at the display. The solar system was still clear. No contacts at the boundary. No signals from the outer dark except the steady telemetry of monitoring stations doing their jobs. The Sentinel network, patient and invisible in its distributed hiding places across 3,400 separate locations, was resting, waiting, as it had always waited. In the days that followed, 2 more civilizations that had been maintaining probe presence in the outer solar system quietly withdrew their monitoring equipment. No announcements, no communications to us. They simply disappeared from the passive sensor records one by one, their probes recalling themselves to wherever they had come from. We tracked the withdrawal trajectories and added them to the Directorate's contact database. One of those civilizations had been monitoring us, our files indicated, for 60 years. They had seen everything. They had watched us from a distance for 6 decades and formed whatever conclusions they had formed. And now, after seeing what the Karath had crossed into, and what remained after, they had decided that the correct response was to move their equipment further away. That, I thought, was a kind of communication too. The quietest kind. The Earth Security Council convened in full session 22 days after the event. I was transported down to the surface for the first time in 11 months, which meant breathing real air and feeling genuine gravity, and being reminded that the thing I had been protecting from my cold seat above the solar system was warm and enormous, and full of people who had been sleeping while I watched. The council chamber was underground, of course, in a facility that had no name on any public record and could not be found on any map that was available to the public. I had been here 4 times before. Each time, the walk from the surface entrance through the long corridor to the chamber felt the same, a kind of decompression, a transition from one version of the world to another. 27 people were seated at the curved table. I stood at the presentation position, which is a small raised platform at the focus of the curve, a place designed so that the person standing there has no desk, no barrier, nothing between them and the questions of the people watching. I had been told this design choice was intentional. Frances Lowe opened the session. She was a tall woman, 61 years old, with gray hair cut close and the kind of direct gaze that comes from spending a career in rooms where imprecision has consequences. She said, "Commander Osi, the Council has reviewed your incident report. We have a number of questions, and I want to begin with the one that has occupied the most discussion in the preceding days." I waited. She said, "Was it the right decision?" I had known this question was coming. I had been preparing my answer for 3 weeks, and when I heard it spoken aloud in that room, I found that I did not want to give the answer I had prepared. I wanted to give a different one, a more honest one. I said, "I am not the right person to answer whether it was right. I am the right person to tell you whether it was deliberate." The room was quiet. I continued. Every parameter was modeled. Every alternative was considered. We had the option to transmit additional warnings. We had the option to attempt to disable individual vessels rather than the fleet as a whole. We had the option to allow a partial crossing and respond proportionally to a more limited incursion. I paused. Each of those alternatives was studied by the Directorate's Planning Division over a period of 4 years, beginning from the date we completed the Sentinel network. The outcome of each modeled alternative was assessed against the primary objective, which is the long-term security of Earth's boundaries. A council member I knew slightly, a man named Philip Gore who represented the South Pacific Bloc and had a background in international law, leaned forward, and the models determined that any partial response would be interpreted as a ceiling, as the maximum we were capable of. Whatever we showed, the Karath would assess it, adapt, and plan their next approach around it. I looked at him directly. "We have studied their tactical doctrine. They are very good at planning around known quantities. The only thing they have no doctrine for is an unknown quantity, an outcome that cannot be reverse engineered because it leaves nothing behind to engineer from." The room was quiet again. Frances Lowe said, 17,000 crew members. "Yes," I said. "And the settlers aboard the colony barges. They did not make the decision to cross." "No," I said. "They did not. Does that weigh on you?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Every day," I said. "And it does not change the answer. Because the answer was not about those 17,000 individuals. It was about 8 billion, and every generation of 8 billion after them. That calculus does not become comfortable by being correct. It only becomes something you can carry." The room held the weight of that for a moment. Then Philip Gore said, "The Karath have now formally requested a boundary exchange." "Yes. This would be the first formal diplomatic contact between Earth and an alien civilization since the Virakai warning." "Yes. What is your recommendation?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it more than anything else in the preceding 3 weeks. Longer than the incident report. Longer than the analysis of the Sentinel sequence. Longer than the Virakai glyph. I had sat with it in my bunk and turned it over in my head during the transport down to the surface, and had not settled on a single clean answer, because there was no single clean answer. "I recommend we respond," I said, "in exactly the same register we have maintained throughout, calm, complete, no elaboration beyond what is asked for. We provide the boundary parameters they requested. We acknowledge their diplomatic contact. We do not describe our capabilities, explain our technology, issue additional warnings, or make any statements about future responses to future crossings. We simply confirm the boundary and confirm that it stands. Because Because the lesson is not that we are powerful, I said. Every civilization in this galaxy has something powerful. The lesson is that we are consistent, that what we say we mean, and what we do completely, and then we go back to being exactly what we were. That is harder to plan against than power. Power can be matched eventually. Consistency is something else. Frances Lowe looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you, Commander. The Council will deliberate." I stepped down from the presentation platform. A staff member showed me to a side room where a chair and a tray of food had been arranged. I sat down and ate without tasting very much of it, because I was thinking about the walk back to the transport, and the ride back up to Meridian, and the console that would be waiting for me on the command deck, showing the Sentinel network in standby, 3,400 platforms in their distributed hiding places, resting and ready. The Council deliberated for 3 hours. They adopted my recommendation in full. The boundary coordinates were transmitted to the Kareth Dominion with no additional message, beyond a single confirming line. These are the parameters of the designated perimeter. The perimeter stands. That was all. 2 weeks after the council session, I was back on Meridian, back in my chair on the command deck, back at the viewport that showed me the solar system in its patient, ancient quiet. Owen Grant had been promoted in my absence, and was now running a second watch shift which meant the command deck had a different quality in the evenings, a slightly different arrangement of people at their stations, a slightly different rhythm to the reports that came in. I found I liked it. I found I liked the evidence of continuity, of the work going on, of younger people taking up positions and doing them well, learning the particular discipline of watching without blinking and caring about the quiet as much as the noise. The Virakai had sent nothing further after the glyph. Their communication array had returned to silence, the same silence it had maintained for 40 years before the event. I did not expect to hear from them again, and I found that I was no longer troubled by that silence. I understood it differently now. The Virakai had done what they could do from where they were. They had named the thing. They had sent the warning. They had waited to see whether the civilization inside the boundary would find the mechanism and understand what to do with it. We had found it. We had understood it. We had used it once, fully and completely and without hesitation, exactly as the thing was designed to be used. And then we had put it away and gone back to the quiet. I sat in my chair one evening, late in the station night, with the command deck running on low light and a skeleton watch shift going about their work at their stations. And I thought about what it means to be a shepherd, not a warrior, not a conqueror. A shepherd is not an aggressive creature. A shepherd does not go looking for trouble. A shepherd's entire purpose is to hold a boundary, to maintain it without drama, to ensure that what is inside the boundary stays safe and what is outside it stays outside. And when something comes across the boundary that should not, a shepherd does not explain at length. A shepherd does not demonstrate. A shepherd simply does what needs doing, completely and without compromise, and then goes back to watching. I had been asked, in a private conversation after the council session, by a young aide who clearly had not intended the question to leave his thoughts and yet said it anyway. "Did you feel like a monster?" I had thought about it for a moment. I had said, I felt like a shepherd. The difference depends on what is inside your fence and what you are willing to do to keep it there. I believe that now more than I did when I said it. The solar system turned. The sun was small and patient at its center. The Sentinel network rested in the dark of asteroid belts and ocean floors and lunar craters, quiet and complete and absolutely ready, the way a lock is ready, the way a wall is ready, the way any good thing built with care and seriousness is ready, not wanting to be needed, but prepared to be, and will be, for as long as it stands. The boundary held, it will hold.